So welcome to all of you, and it's a pleasure for me to talk about what we have been doing in this topic in the last 14 years, although I'm not going to summarize the 40 years. I'm just going to give you some quick ideas of how things have been evolving and we have been learning across the board. So let me first start with a graph that all of you have seen, which is basically the evolution of real prices since earlier in the 70s. And you see clearly the first spike in the 70s, which was where in 75 IFPRI was created. And then you also can see the little spike that happened in 2007, 2008 in real terms. So in real terms, the story was a little bit different to the 70s. And clearly what happened in the slowing down of prices after the 70s was all these changes in terms of policies and investment in agriculture to try to increase the supply to respond to the problems that were faced in the 70s. But have we learned something from this, or was there something different in the 2007, 2008, which we need to learn and not only do what we did in the 70s? And that's something very important. The first topic that I want to raise relative to this is the issue that in the last food crisis, what was called the food crisis, one of the major issues was volatility and excessive levels of volatility. And what this graph is telling you by commodity, how many days of excessive price volatility we had during that period of time. And if you look at the 2007 and 2008, you will see that there was a significant, massive increase in terms of number of days of volatility, which even went over and close to 150 days during those times. And that was different if we extend the graph to the 70s, the number of days of excessive volatility was not at that level. Not only that, most of the commodities were with excessive volatility. And that was a big difference to what happened in 1970s. So something to learn, and also we need to figure out how the policies will have changed because of that, and what new policies will need to be done to resolve that. Now, when I start looking, and IFPRI start looking at what were the policies that were implemented in the 70s, and here I have a picture of the major publications that happened in the 70s. The blue book in the back was done by Alberto Valdez. It was the first book published in IFPRI. And then the other books also was done by him and by other colleagues at IFPRI, looking at what happened in the 70s and what policies were implemented by countries. And in the right-hand side, or in your right-hand side, you have just a recollection of all the policies that governments implemented in the 2007-2008 food crisis. I was telling Alberto that if I take his book and I resell it today, exactly as it was inside, it will have been extremely relevant for what we observe as the policies being implemented by countries as a result of the 2007-2008. All the topics were there: export bans, food subsidies, price stabilization mechanisms, reserves, 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 reserves. So clearly, there was a problem of innovation because the problems were not the same. In 2007 and 2008, agriculture was changing, was different. There was the link with energy. There was the link with nutrition. There were many new things that were happening, a new pressure of demand. So things that we need to learn, and policies should have been changed and should have been different with new innovations. Of course, there were some innovations, and we at IFPRI tried to innovate as much as we could to try to better understand those problems, and especially to be ready to be able to assess what was behind, but essentially to figure out how we can resolve the market failures. What were the causes behind those problems that we can learn today to be able to resolve those market failures, as it was mentioned before? That was central to us. The second thing is that we understood that trade is essential. And if you look at the evolution of the trend of internationalization of food markets, you can see if we convert everything to produce calories crossing international borders, there has been basically double the amount of commodities that cross borders. So trade plays a crucial role. Trade could play a crucial role also to stabilize prices and to have access and to comply with most of the requirements of the food security definition that we handle today. So it's important to understand this trend and this change. It's also important that we understand how things evolve and how are differences between countries. This is an innovative database that we have developed at IFPRI across the world to look at the distance in kilometers traveled by imported calories. And what I want to raise here is the differences across regions. For example, the short differences that you have in Latin American countries compared to Africa. As it was mentioned before, southern corn countries are a huge supply of food today. But they can move foods at a cheaper cost today. Look at the difference in Africa, the countries in Africa. Also look at the difference between Mexico and how it has improved with the trade agreements. So understanding better the differences and here bringing the cost, the transportation cost of these calories, is essential and something that we need to focus carefully and look at it. Also, there has been a significant change in the number of preferential trade agreements. Look at the performance and the evolution of the trade agreements. And we were not able to agree to a common trade agreement through the WTO. So this also changes the paradigm and is something that we need to look carefully. If we look at the protection rates, at the nominal rate of assistance that was mentioned before, look at the performance between Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and what happened in the high-income countries. How they are starting to move from negative levels of assistance, and some of them are starting to become positive, while the high-income countries basically have slowed a little bit. But again, if we want to do policies to markets in countries, to specific commodities, and we don't take into account these things, all our policies, as it was mentioned before, it could basically end not in a solution, but in a different problem, and exacerbate the problem. We did a study, which was pretty important, on looking at what was the cost of the Doha, of not having the Doha round resolved. And the potential loss that we estimate at a maximum level was around $1,064, $1,064 US billion dollars. And this was 336 of potential trade that will have come by the Doha, and 728 billion of trade reduction because of return to protectionism. So clearly the numbers were there. We were able to bring the evidence and show in different scenarios what were the costs of that. But despite that, and despite this was used significantly by WTO, we were not able to help to resolve the problem of Doha. And what is happening today is complicating even more the scenario, and is making more difficult for an agreement like this to happen. Today, we have enormous mega trade deals that are becoming strategic, like the TPP, the TTIP, and also the TISA. So all these agreements between big blocs, big countries, will make it even more difficult to move towards a multilateral agreement like the Doha agreement. So the important thing for us, and all the tools that we have been developing to try to innovate on this, and all the models we have, is to look at all this and trying to understand not only the effects at the macro level, the effects of the policies, but also look at the distributional effects. Today, I feel a lot more comfortable as IFPRI to be able to say that we have enormous amount of machinery of tools that will allow us to assess distributional effects of any of these trade agreements and try to bring evidence of what could happen in terms of the more poor people relative to the higher income people and trying to assess the potential impacts. Thank you so much.